I will bring you out from among the nations. I will gather you from every land where you were scattered and bring you back to the inheritance that was promised to your fathers. At first, it seemed an impossible dream. No nation in the history of mankind had ever been destroyed, its people scattered for millennia and then risen again as a sovereign nation. But what had been written came to pass. A people dispersed across continents, persecuted in every age, exiled for over 2,000 years, returned to the land once given to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. The name Israel, long thought buried in the dust of history, was reborn. And in that rebirth, a prophecy dormant for centuries stirred to life, the vision of the valley of dry bones. Yet that vision is not complete. Two stages have been fulfilled, the regathering of the people and the revival of the nation. But the third stage still awaits, and when it comes, the world itself will tremble. For Israel is not just another nation, it is the clock of prophecy. Every war, every uprising, every alliance and every treaty advances the ticking hands toward a final hour. And that is why we must return to the beginning to see how this vision first unfolded, to trace the path from exile to restoration, to grasp the mystery that still shapes our present and our future. Over 2,500 years ago, Israel was broken. The 10 northern tribes had already been wiped away by Assyria, scattered among the nations, their names fading into obscurity. Only Judah remained, but even Judah had grown weak, corrupt, and divided. Kings like Jehoahaz, Jehoiakim, and Zedekiah sat on the throne, men who ruled not with justice but with compromise, men whose reigns were marked by idolatry, oppression, and fear of the empires rising around them. The temple, though still standing, no longer radiated holiness. Instead, idols defiled its courts, and the cries of the poor were drowned out by greed. The warnings of Jeremiah thundered through the streets, but few listened. And then judgment came, just as the prophets had declared. In 597 BC, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, invaded Jerusalem. This was not the final destruction, not yet, but it was devastating nonetheless. The city remained, but its strength was broken. Thousands were taken into exile, nobles, craftsmen, warriors, and among them a young man named Ezekiel. He was only 25, the son of a priestly family, destined by the law of Moses to begin his service in the temple at the age of 30. But exile tore that destiny away. Ezekiel was carried far from Jerusalem to a settlement called Tel Abib on the banks of the Kabar River in Babylon. There the exiles gathered, a broken community far from Zion, stripped of land, temple, and identity. Some clung to hope, believing their captivity was temporary, that Jerusalem would endure, and they would soon return. Others surrendered to despair, embracing the ways of Babylon and forgetting the covenant of their fathers. The people of God had not only lost their home, they had lost their faith. It was in this place, among the broken-hearted, that Ezekiel reached the age of 30, the very age when he should have entered his priesthood. And at that moment, heaven opened. A storm descended, flashing with fire, blazing with glory. From the heart of the storm came a vision. Living creatures with 4 faces, man, lion, ox, eagle, creatures whose wings stretched outward, whose feet gleamed like bronze, who moved as one with wheels within wheels, wheels covered in eyes, wheels turning without turning. It was the indescribable chariot throne of the Almighty, the glory of God revealed in exile. And Ezekiel realized what he was seeing, the presence of God departing the temple, abandoning Jerusalem. Then came the voice, "Son of man, stand up, and I will speak to you." Trembling, Ezekiel fell face down, but the Spirit lifted him to his feet. A scroll was given to him, written front and back with words of lamentation, mourning, and woe. "Eat this scroll," the Lord said, "and speak to the house of Israel." Ezekiel ate, and though the words carried judgment, they tasted as sweet as honey. From that day forward, he was no longer a priest, but a prophet, appointed as a watchman over his people. He was told to warn them, though they would not listen. His mission was to speak through actions as much as words. He lay on his side for 390 days, bearing the sins of Israel, then 40 more for Judah. He ate rationed bread baked over dung to portray famine. He shaved his head with a sword, dividing the hair into 3 parts, burned, cut, and scattered, to signify fire, sword, and exile. Even the delight of his eyes, his beloved wife, was taken from him. And he was forbidden to mourn, a sign of the merciless destruction soon to fall upon Jerusalem. But in the midst of sorrow, God gave him a vision of hope. The hand of the Lord carried him to a valley, silent and vast, a place where the ground was littered with bones, dry, lifeless, scattered beyond recognition. God said, "Son of man, can these bones live?" Ezekiel looked over the valley, its emptiness screaming of death, its silence heavy with despair. Human wisdom said no, but Ezekiel answered, "Sovereign Lord, you alone know." Then came the command, "Prophesy to these bones. Say to them, 'Dry bones, hear the word of the Lord. I will put breath in you, and you will live. I will attach tendons to you, cover you with flesh, and breathe life into you. Then you will know that I am the Lord." Ezekiel obeyed, and as he spoke, the valley trembled. A sound like thunder rose from the earth as bones began to rattle, shifting, joining, forming skeletons. Tendons stretched, muscles wrapped, skin covered them, and in moments what had been a wasteland of death became filled with bodies, complete yet lifeless, still without breath. Then God spoke again. "Prophesy to the breath. Say, 'Come from the 4 winds, O breath, and breathe upon these slain, that they may live.'" Ezekiel obeyed, and the Spirit of God entered them. Chests heaved, eyes opened, and they stood on their feet. A vast army alive once more. God explained the vision plainly. "These bones are the people of Israel. They say, 'Our bones are dried up, our hope is gone, we are cut off.' But I will open your graves and bring you back to the land of Israel. I will put my spirit in you, and you will live. Then you will know that I, the Lord, have spoken." The prophecy revealed Israel's destiny in 3 stages. First, the bones coming together, the physical return. Second, the flesh and skin covering, the national revival. Third, the breath entering, the spiritual awakening. The first 2 have already come to pass. For centuries the Jews wandered across the earth, driven from nation to nation. The Romans destroyed Jerusalem in 70 AD, scattering Israel to the winds. Through the Middle Ages, they endured exile, pogroms, inquisitions, and finally the horrors of the Holocaust. Yet through it all they clung to a promise. Next year, in Jerusalem. And then, against every expectation, the bones began to rattle. In 1948, after nearly 2,000 years, Israel was reborn. From the United States, Ethiopia, Russia, Yemen, Argentina, Germany, millions returned from over 100 nations. Hebrew, long thought a dead tongue, came alive again. A desert land bloomed. The nation survived wars in every decade and now thrives as a center of technology, agriculture, and strength. The bones and flesh have come together. The first 2 stages are fulfilled, but the breath of God, the Spirit, has not yet descended upon them. That part of the prophecy still waits. The prophets foresaw it. Jeremiah spoke of God's law written on their hearts. Joel promised the Spirit poured out on all flesh. Zechariah declared that one day they would look upon the one they pierced and mourn. Paul wrote that Israel's blindness would last until the fullness of the nations came in, and then all Israel would be saved. Revelation speaks of 144,000 sealed from the tribes of Israel, chosen for a prophetic mission in the last days. The outpouring is coming. The fire of the Spirit will descend, and when it does, the valley of dry bones will not only stand, it will breathe with the breath of God. And yet Ezekiel saw even more. He saw that after the return and before the Spirit's outpouring, a great war would rise. Gog of Magog, a leader from the north, would unite nations, Persia, Cush, Put, Gomer, Togarmah, nations we know today as Iran, Sudan, Libya, Turkey, and others. They would march against restored Israel, a land of unwalled villages, secure in its rebirth. But God declared it would not be Israel who defends itself. He will intervene, earthquakes will strike, armies will turn on each other, fire will fall from heaven. The nations will know that He alone is God, and Zechariah confirmed it. All nations will gather against Jerusalem, the city will be ravaged, but then the Lord will descend. His feet will stand on the Mount of Olives, the very place from which the Messiah once ascended. The vision of the valley of dry bones is still unfolding before our eyes. Israel has returned. The nation lives. The land prospers. The prophetic clock ticks. But the Spirit has not yet come in its fullness. The question remains, when will the breath of God descend? When will the dry bones not only stand, but live? And every event, every conflict, every tremor in Jerusalem brings us closer to that day. Then the thread tightens again, because the vision that raised bones into an army is not an isolated wonder. It is a path that winds forward through the prophets until it steps into our streets and our headlines. And if we follow it carefully, step by step, it carries us from the banks of the Kabar to the hills around Jerusalem and beyond, into days when kings conspire and nations realign, when old languages awaken and ancient appointments on God's calendar keep arriving right on time. And so we keep moving, never stopping, letting each word from long ago unlock the next moment now. The valley stood breathing, and the breath meant destiny, and destiny always draws the story towards Zion, so the Spirit leads us to another watchman, one who dreamed among lions and empires, a man named Daniel, taken as a youth into Babylon like Ezekiel, taught the tongue of the Chaldeans, yet refusing the king's wine. And at night he saw what statues and thrones could not hide. A colossal image with a head of gold, chest of silver, belly of bronze, legs of iron, feet mixed with iron and clay. The ages of empire stacked like metal upon metal until a stone not cut by human hands struck the feet. And the whole image shattered, blown away like chaff, and the stone grew to fill the earth. Daniel saw beasts too, lion, bear, leopard, a fourth with iron teeth and 10 horns, and a little horn rising, speaking arrogant words, warring against the saints, until the Ancient of Days took his seat and the books were opened. And the dominion of the beasts was taken away and given to one like a son of man who came on the clouds and received a kingdom that will not pass away. And this son of man will rule from the place God chose to put his name. The valley of bones had become bodies, the bodies an army, the army a nation, the nation a clock, and Daniel's visions gave the clock its gears. We move closer because Daniel was given a measure of days, a tapestry of weeks 77s decreed upon the holy people in the holy city, a timeline that would include the coming of the Anointed One, and also a covenant confirmed for 1 week, and in the middle of that week, sacrifices would cease, and an abomination would stand where it ought not. And Daniel was told that understanding would come at the end, and that the wise would shine like stars. The words seemed sealed for generations, but not forever, and now they lie open like a road, waiting for footsteps. To speak of sacrifice is to speak of an altar, and to speak of an altar is to whisper about a sanctuary, and to whisper about a sanctuary is to feel the wind circle the mount where Abraham raised his knife, and where Solomon built with cedar and gold, and where after ruin and fire the people still press prayers between stones. And in every generation they ask again whether worship could take its form once more. Daniel's weeks bend attention back to the place Ezekiel measured in his closing chapters, a sanctuary that stretches hope across cubits and courts, and the mind begins to picture priests and water and purity. and someone opens Numbers 19 and reads of a red heifer and ash of cleansing that once restored a nation to ritual life, and many begin to search, to test, to prepare, to wonder if such a thing could ever return. No declaration is needed here, only the recognition that longing has muscle. It lifts bricks, it studies blueprints, it memorizes texts. It trains singers, it teaches children an alphabet in which prophets once wrote, and in the background the prophetic clock ticks on. Then the Spirit carries us from the Temple Mount to a street where two figures stand clothed in sackcloth, because Revelation speaks of them as olive trees and lampstands that stand before the Lord of all the earth, and they prophesy for 1260 days, and if anyone tries to harm them, fire proceeds from their mouths, and they shut the sky that it may not rain, and they strike the earth with every kind of plague. And when they have finished their testimony, the beast that rises from the abyss makes war on them and overcomes them, and the world watches their bodies in a city that is spiritually called Sodom and Egypt, where also their Lord was crucified, and people from tribes and tongues and nations gaze and refuse burial, and after 3.5 days the breath of life enters them, and they stand, and a voice says, "Come up here." And great fear falls on those who see, and an earthquake splits the city, and many give glory to the God of heaven. The valley's breath becomes a street's breath. The bones rising becomes the witnesses rising. The theme repeats. What dies will rise, what has been scattered will be gathered, what is shaken will reveal what cannot be shaken, and the clock keeps moving. But there is more, always more, and the prophets refuse to let the camera stay still. Zechariah shows Jerusalem a cup of trembling for all who surround her, a heavy stone that injures those who try to lift it. And he speaks of a day when God pours out on the house of David and the inhabitants of Jerusalem a spirit of grace and supplication. And they will look upon the one whom they pierced and mourn as for a firstborn. And a fountain will be opened for cleansing, and on that day his feet will stand on the Mount of Olives, and the mountain will split north to south, and living waters will flow from Jerusalem half to the eastern sea and half to the western, and the Lord will be king over all the earth. Ezekiel taught us to watch the bones. Zechariah teaches us to watch the mountain. Daniel tells us to count the days. John tells us to watch the lampstands. Isaiah tells us to watch the desert bloom and to listen for the voice that cries in the wilderness, "Prepare the way of the Lord." Joel tells us to watch the sky, blood and fire and pillars of smoke, sun turned to darkness and moon to blood before the great and awesome day, and that everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved, and that there will be a valley called Decision. Amos says God will raise up the fallen booth of David and repair its breaches. Micah says from Zion will go forth the law, and from Jerusalem the word of the Lord, and nations will beat swords into plowshares, and yet before that peace, birth pains. The Messiah himself tells us how to listen. Look at the fig tree and all the trees. When they put forth leaves, you know summer is near. So when you see these things, know he is near, at the very gates. The fig tree put forth leaves in a spring called 1948, and ever since the sap has been rising, language revived, children singing psalms in the mother tongue of prophets. Fields that once cracked in drought, now ribbed with irrigation, fruit exported to nations that once forgot the name of Zion, and cities built on hills that were once thorns. Yet with every blossom comes wind, and with every harvest, watchmen. Wars followed in tight decades, and survival taught vigilance, and vigilance trained innovation. And innovation drew the eyes of the nations again to the same narrow strip of land where Abraham pitched a tent and David raised a harp, and Solomon bent beneath wisdom like a tree rich with olives. And still the pressure builds, and the prophets are still right. Jerusalem remains the hinge of history. Now the path turns to Ezekiel's pages again, directly after the bones and the breath, to the names that read like a storm map. Gog of the land of Magog, chief prince, and with him Persia, Cush, Put, Gomer, Togarmah, bands from the north and south and east, a confederacy that finds motive in envy and calculation, drawn by hooks placed by God himself, who says he will be sanctified in the sight of nations. The text does not flatter human strategy. It describes a stage on which the Almighty demonstrates that his covenant has not expired, that his arm has not weakened, that he defends what he promised, and the weapons of armies find themselves useless against earthquake and hail and confusion and fire. The bones that once breathed in a valley now breathe under a sky that declares the Lord's name in thunder, and the world learns again that Israel is not merely a geography, but a testimony. Even the aftermath is measured. Years of burning weapons, months of burial, a valley renamed for the humbled invaders, a feast for birds on mountains that had once echoed with psalms. And the camera refuses to cut. It pushes through time, brushing past conversations in chancelleries and forums, over runways and embassies, through ports and deserts, across cables and signals, gliding over a planet knit tighter than any age before, so that whatever touches Jerusalem touches screens everywhere within minutes, and the global village becomes a global witness, and words written on papyrus and parchment step onto fiber and glass, and ancient symbols stride beside satellites. And Revelation HS's phrase, every tribe and language and people and nation, no longer sounds impossible, but inevitable. Technology does not surprise the prophets. It only finally catches up to their scope. The Spirit takes us deeper into Daniel's weeks, to the covenant that is strengthened for 1/7, to the midpoint where sacrifice ceases and an abomination is set up, to a flight toward wilderness reminiscent of an older exodus, to a time, times, and half a time that also measures the ministry of the two witnesses, the trampling of the holy city, the nourishment of a woman in the desert, and in that braid of numbers the narrative tightens. A temple implies an altar implies daily offerings imply an order restored enough to stop, and a stopping implies a provocation that goes too far, and Yeshua's warning from the Mount of Olives echoes across the valleys. When you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel, the prophet standing in the holy place, let the reader understand. Then let those in Judea flee to the mountains. And flight has always been followed by deliverance in Israel's story. So we pay attention to geography, to ridgelines and wadis, to gates and walls, to the way the desert hides and the Lord protects under wings. Yet while the shadows lengthen, light keeps its own cadence. Paul's letter hums beneath the louder drums of crisis, reminding us mystery is not chaos, that a partial hardening has come upon Israel until the fullness of the nations enters, and then all Israel will be saved. And he calls this salvation life from the dead, a phrase that rings like Ezekiel's valley. Like Lazarus at the tomb, like the witnesses on the street, like the morning when stones rolled away and women ran with news that overturned empires. The same Spirit who hovered over waters hovers over timelines, and the breath that animates bones will not fail to animate hearts when the appointed hour arrives. Jeremiah is in that hour too, speaking softly of a law written inside, of hearts of stone turned flesh, of marriages renewed, of knowledge of God that does not need to be taught because it floods like dawn. We look again at the map, and the names of neighbors glow with ancient oracles, a word against Damascus that it will become a ruinous heap, a burden against the nations that encircle, a promise that the tents of Judah will be saved first, a decree that those who seek to cut Jerusalem to pieces will be cut themselves, a vision in which nations mock and then melt, a promise that the Lord will defend, that the feeblest among Judah will be like David, and the house of David, like God, like the angel of the Lord, going before them. The strands seem too many, but they tie to one center, the Lord himself stepping into battle, the Lord himself speaking from Zion, the Lord himself measuring a city with a plumb line of righteousness and with a rod of iron, the Lord himself roaring from Jerusalem so that heaven and earth shake. The end of beasts and the coronation of the Son of Man are one scene viewed from different sides. And still we are not finished, because when the trumpets reach their last and bowls pour out a finish that glows with justice, the text carries us into 1,000 years where swords are indeed hammered into plowshares, where the knowledge of the Lord covers the earth as waters cover the sea, where children play by dens once feared and are not harmed, where vines are planted and enjoyed without fear that another will harvest them, where nations go up year by year to worship the King and to keep the feast, where the river that Ezekiel saw flows from the threshold, deepening from ankle to knee to waist, healing what it touches, importing life into a desert that has learned to sing again. The nations are not erased in that song, they are instructed. They learn a melody written in Zion and exported by mercy. But before song, trumpet, before trumpet, travail, before travail, sign, before sign, gathering. The breath in the valley was the first announcement that God would not let history close without keeping his vows, and every promise he made to Israel became a lantern for the nations, and every mercy he gives to the nations becomes a mirror to Israel. And in that exchange stands a remnant, sealed 12,000 from each tribe, a number that sounds like a census and a mission roster servants marked to proclaim the Lamb in days when beasts roar, and alongside them a multitude no one can number from every nation and tribe and people and language. Clothed in white, holding palm branches, crying salvation, and their voices do not erase the particularity of Israel. They amplify it until the melody of Abraham its promise. In you all the families of the earth will be blessed, becomes audible at last. So we watch the clock, but not with fear, with sobriety, with oil in lamps, and prayers in the throat, with eyes that can tell a leaf from a bud and a season from a storm. We watch the rehearsals on the calendar God gave, appointed times that trained a people to expect visitations. And we remember that fulfillments always exceed rehearsals. We listen for shofars that have called assemblies and battles and jubilees, and we recall that a great trumpet remains, one that raises incorruptible and gathers from the four winds. We consider that for offerings to stop, offerings must begin, and for offerings to begin, a sequence of courage and controversy must unfold in a world that measures everything and knows the cost of every stone. And yet even there, the prophets insist the main actor is not a council, not a coalition, not a strongman, but the Lord who wrote the script. The narrative bends again toward the simple sights that outlast empires. A farmer tying a grapevine to a line, a shepherd mending a fence near a hill where psalms were sung, a child learning the letters Aleph Bet Gimel with a finger in dust, an old man at a wall pressing a folded prayer that says, "Our bones were dry, but you breathed," and a young woman reading Zechariah and whispering, "A spirit of grace and supplication," and a traveler stepping off a plane, hearing Hebrew echo in a terminal built where drought once cracked the earth, and an engineer laying fiber that will carry broadcasts from a plaza where nations once sent tributes and now send cameras, and somewhere a student opens Ezekiel and counts stages, return, rebuild, revive, and then looks up because wind has begun to move through olive leaves with a sound like pages turning. Nothing in this story wastes pain. Ezekiel's grief was a sign, and the nation's griefs have become milestones. The bread baked over dung became lessons in famine, and the ration was memory. The shaved hair became a chart of outcomes, and the scattered strands were seen again as passengers with suitcases. The lying on sides for 390 days and 40 more became a weight measured in centuries. And the end of the count was the click of a switch in a hall in Tel Aviv, where a declaration was read and a flag was raised. And very far away, a boy in another country heard the name Israel as something present tense for the first time, and asked his grandfather why the old word was new again, and the old man answered, because the dry bones were listening. And still the breath waits in fullness, hovering the way it hovered over waters, before land rose the way it hovered over a girl in Nazareth, before the word took flesh, the way it hovered over a tomb in a garden, before a stone rolled and the world changed. The prophets have done what they were sent to do. They have built a bridge of expectation from exile to kingdom, and the bridge passes through our hour, through our screens and streets, through our calendars and anxieties, through rumors and treaties, through flare-ups and quiet years, and the bridge holds, because it is anchored in words God swore by his own name. The bones are not asking whether God can. They have already stood to prove that he has. They are asking when the wind will fill every lung, when the song will rise in every court, when the fountain will cleanse every heart, when the writing will glow inside like fire shut up in bones that are no longer dry. So we keep moving, because the story refuses to end where most stories end. It does not pause at declarations or battles or even miracles. It pushes on toward a table prepared in the presence of enemies, toward a city that descends like a bride adorned, toward gates that never shut, toward leaves that heal, toward names written, and tears wiped. And yet before that city comes a day on a mountain, and before that day a night on another, and around those days and nights a nation that once died and rose, until finally the breath does not leave again. And if the prophets have taught us anything, it is this: to keep our eyes on the place God chose, to keep our ears tuned to the words he said, to keep our feet ready to move when the wind rises, to keep our hearts soft, so that when law is written, there it finds parchment, not stone. And as the camera keeps gliding over hills and alleys and rooftops and walls, catching the glint of a city that has survived more fires than any map can record, the narrative continues forward, because the next sound may be a trumpet, and the next scene may be a mountain splitting, and the next breath may be the one that finishes what began in a valley where bones learned again how to stand.